My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an ICU nurse in Boston. For as long as I can remember, I dreamed of having a place to call my own. I wasn't born into wealth, and nothing was ever handed to me easily. Every dollar I've earned has come from long nights at the hospital, holidays spent at work instead of with family, and countless sacrifices people my age often take for granted. After 10 years of grinding, saving, and refusing to give up, I finally signed the papers and bought my first home. But as proud as that moment was, nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that followed. Because soon after, my own parents showed up at my doorstep with suitcases, announcing they were moving in without asking me. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. This is not just a story about buying a home or becoming independent. It's about what happens when the people you love the most cross a line so deeply that it shakes everything you thought you knew about family. If you've ever experienced favoritism, betrayal, or had relatives who treated your sacrifices as if they were owed to them, you'll understand exactly where I'm coming from. And if you haven't, maybe my story will make you rethink what it really means to set boundaries with family. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Have you ever had someone in your family assume they had rights over your life or your space without ever asking you? And while you're at it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because these kinds of stories are never as simple as they seem. I still remember the day I first walked into my house. It was a modest 3-bedroom in Cambridge, nothing flashy, but to me it felt like a castle. Sunlight streamed through the windows onto bare hardwood floors, and in that empty living room, I broke down in tears. That house represented more than just walls and a roof. It was proof of every shift I worked, every loan payment I made, and every single time I told myself not to give up. For the first time in my life, I felt secure. This was my safe place, my sanctuary, a space no one could take away from me. At least, that's what I believed in that moment. But safety in families can be an illusion. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who can unsettle your world in ways you never imagined. My story isn't about strangers or outsiders, it's about my own parents and brother, people I thought were supposed to protect me, not take advantage of me. I never imagined that after decades of feeling like the responsible one, the reliable one, the overlooked one, I would end up facing the biggest betrayal of all from the very people who raised me. And it all started with one seemingly innocent tradition: Sunday family dinners in my new home. Little did I know, those meals would mark the beginning of cracks that would turn into an earthquake, shaking the very foundation of what I thought family was. When people look at my family from the outside, they usually see a picture of normalcy. We lived in Newton, Massachusetts, in a quiet neighborhood, with tree-lined streets, and the kind of houses where kids rode bikes in the summer, and parents waved at each other from driveways. My dad, Robert, worked as an accountant at a local firm, steady and meticulous. My mom, Linda, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school just a few blocks from home. And then there were the two of us children: Ryan, my older brother by 3 years, and me, the youngest, the one who learned early that expectations would never be divided equally in our household. If you've ever grown up in a family where favoritism was obvious, you'll understand how much it shapes you. In our house, Ryan could do no wrong, and I could rarely do right. When Ryan forgot his homework in middle school, Mom would drive to the school to hand it to him with a smile. When he announced halfway through baseball season that practices were too early, Dad simply nodded and said, "Maybe next year's sport will suit you better." But when I asked if I could quit piano lessons so I could focus on my science club, something I was truly passionate about, I got a half-hour lecture about commitment, responsibility, and how Carter kids didn't quit. That moment stuck with me, because it was one of the first times I realized the rules were never going to be the same for the two of us. The pattern continued through high school. Ryan barely scraped by, while I juggled AP classes, a 4 gigapascals, and a weekend job at CVS to save money for college. My parents never pressured Ryan about his future, but when I dared to mention nursing school, Mom frowned. "Sweetheart, that's so demanding. Why not pick something easier?" Her words stung, not because she didn't believe I could handle nursing, but because she seemed so surprised that I wanted to push myself. Meanwhile, they paid for Ryan to attend community college, something he dropped out of after 2 months. They paid for trade school too, which lasted only a few weeks longer. Each time he failed, they welcomed him back with smiles and home-cooked meals. When I asked how I was supposed to pay for school, they shrugged and told me I was resourceful. And I was. I got scholarships. I took out loans. I waited tables on overnight shifts at a 24-hour diner. Exhausted but determined. I can still remember the smell of burnt coffee that clung to my scrubs as I walked into clinical rotations, running on no sleep. Graduation was bittersweet. My parents came, of course, but their pride seemed muted compared to the way they celebrated Ryan when he finally landed his first stable job at a car dealership years later. I'll never forget the glow on their faces, the way they beamed as if he had finally turned into the son they always hoped for. I stood on the sidelines that day, remembering how they had barely clapped for me at my nursing school graduation. Ryan's job didn't last, of course. It never did. He lost that position at the dealership within a year and moved back home again. But he had a shiny new car, co-signed by my parents, something they proudly pointed out whenever I questioned his lack of direction. "At least he has reliable transportation for interviews," Mom would say, as if that excused everything. Meanwhile, I was living in a tiny studio apartment near Memorial Hospital, working extra shifts to chip away at student loans, putting away every dollar I could into what I called my someday house fund. For 7 long years, I lived frugally. No new furniture, no vacations, barely any nights out. My life was a steady grind of work, sleep, and saving. Ryan, on the other hand, drifted from one half-baked plan to another, always with my parents cushioning his fall. He had failed at more things than I could count, and yet every time, he was met with compassion and excuses. I began to wonder if they even saw me. Looking back now, I think the resentment was already growing inside me, long before the bigger betrayals happened. It wasn't just about fairness, it was about the message their choices sent me over and over, that Ryan's failures deserved support and comfort, but my discipline and ambition didn't deserve equal recognition. I was expected to be the strong one, the reliable one, the one who needed nothing, and because of that, they felt entitled to take me for granted. It was in those years that I started to notice a quiet but dangerous shift in our family dynamic. Ryan's dependency was no longer just tolerated, it was normalized. And my independence, instead of being celebrated, became ammunition. "You'll be fine," they would say whenever I asked for even the smallest amount of help. "You always figure it out." Those words sound like praise, but they were really an excuse to keep funneling everything into Ryan while leaving me to carry my own burdens. The real twist, though, was that I still wanted them close. As much as I resented the favoritism, I longed for connection, for some version of family that felt safe and whole. That's why, after buying my house, I thought hosting Sunday dinners was a good idea. I thought maybe, finally, we could rewrite old patterns. Maybe sharing meals in my home would help us reconnect in a healthier way. But what I didn't realize at the time was that the imbalance hadn't gone anywhere. It had just evolved into something bigger, something more destructive. And those family dinners, the ones I hoped would bring us together, were about to reveal the first cracks in a foundation I had always assumed was solid. That's where things began to shift in ways I could never have anticipated. Because sometimes the roles we're cast into as children, golden child, caretaker, black sheep don't just fade away with age. They follow us, shaping every choice, every conflict, every betrayal that comes later. And for me, the cost of being the reliable one was about to come crashing down in the most personal way possible. Which brings me to the next part of my story, the moment those subtle cracks became impossible to ignore. It started small, with little changes I brushed off, but soon those moments would spiral into something far more dangerous, leading me straight into the storm I never saw coming. I still remember the day I walked through the doors of the house that would eventually become mine. It wasn't the kind of place that made people gasp when they pulled into the driveway. It wasn't flashy, it didn't have a sprawling lawn or a gourmet kitchen with marble counters. But to me, it was perfect. 3 bedrooms, a small yard that caught the morning light, and hardwood floors that creaked just enough to remind me of the homes I'd visited as a child. The house was tucked away in Cambridge, not far from Harvard Square. And when I first stepped inside, it felt less like a purchase and more like destiny. The seller, Margaret, was 85 years old and a retired nurse. When she found out I was also a nurse, she invited me over for tea before I even made my offer. I can still picture her delicate china cups resting on lace doilies as she pulled out photographs from her career, her in the crisp white uniform of the 1962nd, standing proud with colleagues outside Massachusetts General Hospital. She told me she'd spent 40 years in that home, and though she had received a higher bid, she wanted to sell it to me. "I'd rather pass it on to someone who understands what it means to care," she said softly, and I felt something stir inside me. For once, it felt like the universe was recognizing how hard I had worked. Signing the papers was surreal. I had spent nearly a decade grinding, saving, and sacrificing, and it all led to that one moment. I stood in the empty living room, the echo of my own footsteps ringing off the walls, and tears rolled down my face. This wasn't just a house, it was proof of my determination. I thought about every double shift I had worked, every holiday I had missed, every night I walked home from the hospital too tired to even eat, and how it had all brought me here. I didn't buy that house for luxury. I bought it for peace, for stability, for the kind of sanctuary I had been craving since I was a teenager. And I intended to make it my own in every way. That first month, I spent hours painting the walls, sanding down the banisters, and carefully choosing furniture that reflected me. I didn't go overboard. Most of my furniture was second-hand, but I arranged everything with intention. I bought a dining table that could seat 6 because, despite the complications with my family, I still dreamed of gathering around a table together, like families are supposed to. I wanted to believe that maybe, in my own home, things could be different. That maybe the old wounds of favoritism and neglect wouldn't matter as much when I was the one setting the table, cooking the meals, and inviting them into my space. And so, I started a tradition. Every Sunday, I would cook dinner and invite my parents and Ryan. It was my way of showing them that I wasn't just capable of building a life on my own. I was also willing to keep them in it. The first dinner was almost magical. I made my mom's lasagna recipe, the one she had perfected years ago, and served it with garlic bread and a salad. My dad brought a bottle of wine, and for a brief moment, the air felt light, like we had left the old tensions behind. Ryan showed up late, of course, but he cracked jokes, and for a moment I laughed with him. I remember thinking, maybe this could work. Maybe I could have both a home of my own and a family that finally felt whole. But as the weeks passed, little things began to surface. Dad seemed distracted, pulling out his phone mid-conversation, stepping outside to take calls. Mom started making comments about the cost of groceries and how retirement wasn't as easy as she thought it would be. They brushed off my questions with vague reassurances, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface. And then, there was Ryan. He showed up wearing a new watch one week, a Rolex that gleamed under the light, and boasted about touring luxury apartments in Boston's Seaport district. The rent he casually mentioned was nearly double my mortgage. I wanted to ask how he could afford it, but I bit my tongue. Confrontations with Ryan always ended with him acting offended, and my parents rushing to his defense. Still, the questions nagged at me. How was he suddenly living large while I was still stretching every dollar? Why did my parents seem so restless, so uneasy? The air around our Sunday dinners grew heavier, but I told myself not to read too much into it. After all, families go through phases, right? That's what I kept repeating, even as the knot in my stomach grew tighter each week. The truth is, I didn't want to face the possibility that the sanctuary I had fought so hard for might not stay mine. I didn't want to believe that the very people I was opening my doors to could be the ones to shake its foundation. But deep down, I think I sensed it coming. I think part of me knew that peace in my family was always fragile, always dependent on unspoken rules that left me carrying the heavier load. And so, I ignored the signs. I kept setting the table every Sunday, kept cooking meals, kept telling myself I was doing the right thing by keeping us connected. But what I didn't realize then was that those dinners weren't building stronger bonds. They were laying the groundwork for the kind of betrayal I never thought I'd experience. Because soon, those subtle cracks in our Sunday tradition would widen into something impossible to ignore. And once the truth came out, my dream home would no longer feel like mine at all. It would feel like a stage for the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about my family. It started out small, almost invisible at first, the kind of changes you brush off because you don't want to make them bigger than they are. After all, every family has quirks, right? And I wanted so badly to believe that the Sunday dinners I hosted were working, that we were creating something warm, something stable, something worth all the effort I was putting into them. But sometimes the cracks don't show until you look back, until you replay the little moments you ignored and realize they were warnings all along. At first, it was my dad. Robert had always been a steady man, the kind who balanced our family checkbook down to the penny, who had entire file folders organized by year, color-coded and labeled. But during those dinners, he began checking his phone constantly. His plate would grow cold while he stepped outside for calls, muttering something vague about work stuff. He was retired. What work could possibly require so much secrecy? I asked once, lightly, joking that he was busier now than he had been when he actually had a job. He just smiled tightly and said, "Old habits die hard." But I saw the lines around his mouth deepen, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. Then it was my mom. Linda had always been cheerful, if sometimes a little overbearing, but suddenly she made comments that didn't sit right with me. She would sigh and say, "Groceries are getting so expensive," or, "I don't know how people live on fixed incomes." At first, I nodded sympathetically. Life was getting more expensive for everyone. But there was an edge to her words, a sharpness I hadn't heard before, like she wasn't just talking about prices but hinting at something deeper. When I pressed, she brushed me off. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," she said. But her eyes betrayed her, darting away, refusing to meet mine. And then there was Ryan. My brother was the wild card, always had been, but even for him, something seemed different. He showed up one Sunday wearing a brand new Rolex, the kind of watch that screamed money. I couldn't help but stare. Ryan had never been good with jobs or finances. He drifted from one short-lived opportunity to another, always relying on our parents to catch him when he fell. Yet there he was, proudly flashing a watch that probably cost more than half my monthly mortgage. I tried to play it cool, asked him casually where it came from. He smirked, shrugged, and said, "A little reward for myself." That would have been enough to unsettle me, but then he started talking about looking at apartments in Boston's Seaport district. The Seaport, luxury high-rises, waterfront views, gyms, rooftop pools. Rent there was astronomical. I knew because I had looked at listings out of curiosity once and immediately closed my laptop, muttering, "Not in this lifetime." And yet here was Ryan, nonchalantly saying he'd toured one-bedrooms that cost twice my mortgage. I sat at the table, listening to him brag, and every nerve in my body screamed that something wasn't right. My parents didn't react at all, which only made it worse. They just kept eating, nodding, as if this was normal, as if Ryan had suddenly become the kind of man who could afford designer watches and seaport apartments. I wanted to demand answers right there, but the tension in the room was thick, and I knew that if I pushed, I would be the one accused of ruining dinner. After that, I started noticing more. The way Dad avoided my eyes when Ryan talked about money. The way Mom changed the subject whenever I asked about their retirement plans. I felt like an outsider in my own family, sitting at my own table, watching a play I hadn't been given the script for. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more the unease clawed at me. One evening, I stayed behind in the kitchen after dinner, washing dishes while Mom dried them. I decided to test the waters. "You've seemed a little stressed lately," I said gently. "Are you and Dad okay with money? If you ever need help, you know you can talk to me." She froze for just a moment, long enough for me to notice, before forcing a laugh. "Oh, Emily, you always worry too much. We're fine." But her hands trembled slightly as she stacked the plates, and I knew she was lying. The worst part was the way they made me feel like I was imagining things. Every time I voiced concern, I was brushed off. Every time I caught a glimpse of truth, they covered it with reassurances that didn't quite fit. And Ryan? He basked in the glow of their silence, his smug grin widening each week as his lifestyle grew more extravagant. One night, after everyone left, I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the empty wine glasses and crumpled napkins. The house felt eerily quiet, and for the first time since I bought it, I didn't feel proud. I felt nervous. My sanctuary no longer felt untouchable. I had worked so hard to build a life where I was finally in control, yet somehow, I sensed control slipping through my fingers without even knowing why. That sense of dread followed me into work, into bed, into the quiet moments of my day. I told myself I was being paranoid, that families sometimes keep things private, that not everything had to involve me. But I couldn't ignore the way my stomach twisted when I replayed Ryan's words about luxury apartments, or the way Mom's voice cracked when she insisted everything was fine. What I didn't know then was that these cracks weren't random. They were the beginning of something far larger, something that would soon crash down on me with the force of betrayal I never could have prepared for. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just explain the Rolex or the phone calls or the evasive answers, it would shatter the foundation of everything I thought I understood about my family. The night it all came out started like any other Sunday. I cooked, I set the table, I poured the wine. But by the end of that dinner, I would realize just how naive I had been, and that the home I had fought so hard for was about to become the stage for a drama I never saw coming. The night of the reveal is burned into my memory, not because anything looked unusual at first, but because of how ordinary it seemed. That's the cruelest part about betrayal. It rarely comes with flashing red lights or blaring alarms. It sneaks in quietly, wrapping itself in the comfort of routine, until it explodes in your face. It was a Sunday like any other. I had spent the afternoon preparing dinner, determined to make it special. Pot roast with all the fixings, mashed potatoes whipped until they were smooth and buttery, carrots glazed with honey, and a bottle of wine my father had always loved. I set the table with the nicer dishes, the ones I had splurged on during a department store sale, and even polished the silverware until it gleamed. This wasn't just dinner, it was my way of reminding myself and my family that this house, my house, was a home worth gathering in. When the doorbell rang, I expected the usual greetings. But as soon as my parents walked in, I sensed something was off. My mom was unusually quiet, her smile stiff, her eyes darting around the room instead of meeting mine. My dad seemed restless, his movements jerky, his voice too loud as he commented on the smell of the roast. I tried to push the unease aside. Maybe they were tired, maybe they had argued before arriving. But then Ryan texted to say he was running late due to traffic. I knew for a fact the roads were clear. I had just driven them myself on my grocery run. By the time Ryan finally showed up, I was already on edge. He strolled in with that smug expression I had come to dread, wearing yet another designer watch I hadn't seen before. He sat down as if nothing was unusual, launching into a story about checking out apartments in Boston's Seaport district. He described the views of the harbor, the rooftop lounge, the concierge service, all the luxuries that seemed impossibly out of reach for someone with his spotty employment history. I forced a smile, but inside, my anxiety was building. Once we had all served ourselves, my father cleared his throat, the way he always did when he wanted attention. "There's some big news," he announced, his voice a little too cheerful. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. "Your mother and I have decided to sell the house," he said. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. "Sell the house?" I repeated. "Our family home," my mother added quickly, her eyes still avoiding mine. "It's just time." The words hit me like a physical blow. That house wasn't just a building, it was 25 years of birthdays, holidays, late-night talks, and childhood memories. It was where I had studied at the kitchen table until my eyes burned, where Ryan had played video games in the basement for hours, where Mom had made her famous Christmas cookies. It was our anchor, and suddenly, it was gone. I asked the only question I could form. But why? Mom gave a little shrug. The neighborhood is changing. And the stairs, well, they're getting harder on our knees. Dad nodded. And the market is hot right now. Our realtor says we can get top dollar. I looked at Ryan, expecting him to share in my shock, but he was calmly cutting his meat, his expression unreadable. That was when I knew he had already known. Maybe he had known for weeks, maybe longer. I forced myself to stay composed. When are you thinking of moving? That's the other surprise, my mom said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We've already accepted an offer. Closing is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My fork clattered against the plate. 3 weeks? Have you even found a new place to live? We're figuring that out, my dad said quickly, dismissively. As if the details didn't matter. The conversation spiraled from there. I offered to help them look at senior apartments, maybe a community in Brookline or Somerville where they could have support without being too far from me. My mom bristled immediately. We're not that old, Emily. We're not ready for a retirement home. I didn't say retirement home, I corrected, trying to keep my voice steady. I said senior apartments. They're just apartments for people over 55. They have nice amenities, social events. Well, think about it, my dad said in that tone I knew too well, the one that meant he had no intention of thinking about it at all. That was when Ryan finally spoke. Mom and Dad know what they're doing, Emily. You don't need to micromanage their decisions. The comment stung, especially coming from him. I wanted to shout that I was only trying to help, that someone had to be the practical one because clearly no one else was. But the look on my parents' faces, the discomfort, the evasion told me there was more here than they were admitting. Dinner ended in awkward silence, each of us pushing food around our plates, until my parents finally claimed they were tired and left early. I stood in the quiet house afterward, the smell of pot roast lingering in the air, my appetite gone. The knot in my stomach had turned into a boulder. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the story I had just been fed was only half the truth. 3 days later, the truth found me. My mom's old friend Diane called from Florida, her voice bright and warm at first. But after a few pleasantries, she dropped a bomb. I heard Linda and Robert sold the house, she said. She mentioned they were downsizing, but I didn't realize it would happen so quickly. At least Ryan's getting set up nicely. That must be a relief for your mom. I nearly dropped the phone. What do you mean, getting set up nicely? There was a pause on the other end. Oh, I assumed you knew. Linda mentioned they were helping Ryan financially. Something about him finally being responsible enough to manage his own place. My vision blurred as the pieces fell into place. The Rolex, the seaport apartment tours, Ryan's calm demeanor at dinner. I hung up as politely as I could, then sat on my couch, motionless, as the reality sank in. My parents had sold our family home. They hadn't used the money to secure their future, to downsize responsibly, to make life easier in retirement. They had given it, almost all of it, to Ryan. The betrayal was a living thing inside me, clawing at my chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the money. It was the secrecy, the lies, the way they had left me completely out of the decision. And the worst part was knowing that Ryan had accepted it, that he was complicit in taking what should have secured our parents' future and using it to fund his luxury lifestyle. I wanted answers, and I wanted them immediately. My hands shook as I picked up my phone, ready to call Ryan, ready to demand the truth from his own mouth. I didn't know then how much worse it would get, how the choices my parents had made would come crashing into my life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Because as shocking as this revelation was, it was only the beginning. The real nightmare started when they showed up on my doorstep, suitcases in hand, expecting me to fix the mess they had created. It was a Saturday morning when the pounding on my front door jolted me awake. I had just finished a brutal overnight shift at the hospital and had been looking forward to sleeping in for once. Still half dreaming, I shuffled to the door in my pajamas, rubbing my eyes. When I opened it, I froze. There on my porch stood my parents, Linda and Robert, each with a suitcase in hand. Behind them, my father's pickup truck was parked at the curb, its bed piled high with boxes, lamps, and what looked suspiciously like our old living room furniture. "Surprise!" my mother chirped, her voice far too cheerful for that early hour. Before I could process, my dad stepped forward with a box in his arms. "We closed earlier than expected," he explained, brushing past me like he was walking into his own home. "Where should we put this? The movers will be here with the rest in a couple of hours." I blinked at him, my mind trying and failing to catch up. "The rest?" I repeated dumbly. "Oh, just some essentials," Mom said breezily, already dragging her suitcase over the threshold. The storage unit couldn't fit everything. I stood rooted to the spot, heart hammering. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even warned me. They had just shown up, suitcases in hand, assuming my house, my sanctuary, would be theirs too. By the time I found my voice, they were already moving in. The guest room filled with boxes within an hour. My office, the space where I paid bills and studied for continuing education credits, was commandeered for Mom's sewing machine. Dad positioned his oversized recliner directly across from my television, displacing the armchair I had chosen carefully to match the room. I wandered the halls of my own home like a stranger, watching as the life I had built was swallowed up by theirs. In the kitchen, my mother began unloading cartons of spices and mismatched cookware. She rearranged my neatly organized cabinets without a word, moving my baking supplies across the room and shoving my meal prep containers into a drawer I rarely used. "Your system doesn't make sense," she said casually when I tried to protest. "Why would anyone keep flour so far from the oven?" I bit my tongue. It was easier than fighting. But inside, I felt something sharp and heavy, pressing down on my chest. This was my house, my safe place, and in a matter of hours, it no longer felt like mine. By evening, every surface bore their fingerprints. Family photos I hadn't agreed to hang appeared on the walls. Old throw pillows I had long since hidden in storage reappeared on my couch, clashing violently with my decor. The lavender-scented candles I used to unwind after a shift were replaced by the stronger, cloying smell of my mother's potpourri. When I went to bed that night, the familiar creaks of my house were replaced by new sounds. The thump of drawers opening and closing, the murmur of their voices through the thin walls. Lying there in the dark, I told myself it would be temporary. A week, maybe 2. They would find an apartment, settle into their new life, and I would get my space back. But even as I whispered those reassurances, my gut told me I was lying to myself. The days that followed only proved me right. My father quickly established a morning routine that clashed violently with mine. At 5:30 a.m., while I was still trying to sleep after long night shifts, he blasted the morning news at full volume, the anchors' voices rattling the walls. My mother declared the kitchen her domain, and dismissed my healthy meal preps as rabbit food, replacing them with heavy casseroles and cakes. "You work too hard to eat like this," she scolded, pushing a plate of lasagna toward me after I had just finished a salad. I tried to set boundaries, gently at first. I reminded them that I worked long shifts, that I needed quiet in the mornings, that I had a system that worked for me. But every attempt was met with resistance. "You're always at the hospital," Mom said. "What does it matter how the kitchen is organized?" Dad chimed in with, "We raised you for 18 years in our home. You can spare a couple of rooms for us." Their words landed like stones, each one eroding the fragile walls I was trying to build. The worst was the constant invasion of my time and space. I would come home after 12 hours on my feet, desperate for silence, only to find people in my living room, my parents' friends, my aunts and uncles, even members of their church congregation. They held brunches and Bible study sessions without asking, filling my house with voices, laughter, and the clatter of dishes. Once, I walked into my bedroom, the one space I had declared off-limits, only to find my bed covered in an old quilt from my childhood. "I thought you'd appreciate some character," Mom said when I confronted her. My private space was no longer private. Each night, I lay awake with tears burning in my eyes, exhaustion mixing with a deep sense of betrayal. I had fought for this house, worked for every nail and board, every dollar of that mortgage. And yet here I was, a guest in my own sanctuary. My parents had taken the money they should have used to secure their future, handed it to Ryan, and now they were using me as their safety net without ever asking, without even pretending to respect my boundaries. The breaking point came one morning when I stumbled into the kitchen after a double shift, too tired to think straight. I found my father sitting at my table with two of his friends, beer bottles already scattered across the surface. The game played loudly on the television in the other room, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. My mother was fussing over them, offering snacks, as if it were her house, her rules, her life. I stood there, gripping the counter, my vision tunneling. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't accidental. They weren't treating this as my home at all. To them, this was just the next chapter of their lives, a chapter they had written without me, casting me as the reluctant host in a story I never agreed to be part of. That morning, as my father laughed with his friends, and my mother rearranged my fridge, I realized with a sinking certainty that the life I had built for myself was slipping away. If I didn't act soon, if I didn't find the strength to push back, I would lose more than just a house. I would lose myself. And I had no idea yet just how much further they were willing to push, how far they would go in claiming what was never theirs to begin with. Because the true test of my boundaries, and my sanity, was only just beginning. The slow creep of disrespect turned into a tidal wave before I realized what was happening. What began with subtle intrusions became blatant violations, each one chipping away at my patience, my sanity, and my sense of ownership in my own home. I kept telling myself to breathe, to be patient, to give them grace because they were my parents. But every day, they pushed further, as if testing how much I would endure before I finally broke. My father was the first to claim dominance. His recliner became the centerpiece of my living room, positioned squarely in front of my television. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., without fail, he blasted the news at a volume that rattled the windows. I begged him to use headphones, reminded him I often worked overnight shifts and needed sleep. He brushed me off with a laugh. "You're young, Emily. You'll survive on less sleep. I'm the one who needs to hear it loud." There was no negotiation in his tone, only entitlement. My mother made the kitchen her kingdom. The meal prep containers I relied on to stay healthy during long hospital shifts vanished into the back of cabinets, replaced by heavy casseroles, cream pies, and the kind of food that left me sluggish. "You work too hard to eat like a rabbit," she said dismissively when I reached for a salad. "You need real meals." No matter how many times I explained my system, she rearranged it again, each time leaving less of myself in the room I once loved most. But the intrusions weren't limited to daily routines, they became full-scale takeovers. One Saturday, I came home after losing a patient at the hospital, emotionally raw and desperate for quiet. Instead, I opened my door to find my living room filled with strangers. My parents had invited their church group for a potluck dinner. 16 people I had never met were laughing, spilling drinks on my furniture, helping themselves to my dishes. My mother waved me over like I was the hostess. "Come meet Pastor Williams," she called, as if this were her house to offer. I stood frozen, still in scrubs, my heart pounding in disbelief. I mumbled a greeting, then bolted upstairs, my chest aching. When I reached my room, I found the final insult waiting for me. My bedspread had been replaced with an old childhood quilt I hadn't seen in decades. My sanctuary had been invaded. When I confronted my mom later, she looked genuinely confused. "That old comforter you had was so plain," she explained. "I thought you'd like something with more character. You're overreacting." Her words cut deep, not just because she dismissed me, but because she made me feel like a guest in my own life. The final straw came weeks later. I walked into what used to be my office and stopped cold. The space where I paid bills, took online courses, and sometimes just sat in peace had been completely transformed. The desk was shoved into a corner, my books packed into boxes, and a daybed I had bought for the occasional overnight guest was neatly made up with fresh sheets. My father appeared in the doorway, unfazed. "Your mother thought it would be good for Ryan to have a room here," he said. "Since he's been so busy with the new place, we hardly see him." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "That was my office," I said, my voice tight. "You can use the kitchen table," he replied, as if my work and privacy were disposable. It was as if the walls of my house were closing in, suffocating me. Every attempt I made to set boundaries was dismissed, ridiculed, or outright ignored. The words, "This is my house," held no weight with them. In their eyes, they had raised me, provided for me, and now the house I worked for was somehow theirs by extension. The moment I realized just how little respect they had left for me came with the sound of metal scraping against wood. I walked in one afternoon to find a locksmith at my front door, removing my locks. My stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" I demanded. The man looked up sheepishly. "Just replacing the locks, ma'am. Order placed by Robert Carter." I called my father, my voice shaking with fury. "Why is there a locksmith changing my locks?" "Oh, your mother kept misplacing her key," he said casually, as if this were a minor inconvenience. "I thought it would be easier just to get new ones. Don't worry, I'll give you copies." My grip tightened on the phone. "This is my house," I hissed. "You don't get to change my locks without asking me." "Don't be dramatic, Emily," he scoffed. "It's just locks." But it wasn't just locks. It was my autonomy, my control, my home slipping away, one boundary at a time. I made the locksmith stop immediately, verifying my ID to prove I was the rightful owner. The man left, apologetic, while my father acted as though I had committed a crime by objecting. That night, I sat in my living room staring at the furniture I hadn't arranged, breathing in the scent of potpourri I hadn't chosen, listening to the hum of the television I hadn't turned on. Tears burned hot in my eyes, not just from exhaustion, but from the realization that my parents didn't see me as an adult with rights, or even as their daughter with feelings. They saw me as an extension of themselves, someone who owed them obedience, space, and sacrifice. The truth crystallized in that moment. Polite requests would never be enough. Setting boundaries with words had failed. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I would need to take action, even if it meant shattering whatever fragile bond remained between us. But before I could gather the strength to fight back, I needed clarity, allies, and a plan. Because it was no longer about whether they would cross boundaries they already had. The real question was how far they were willing to go, and how much more I was willing to lose before I finally said enough. I reached my breaking point one gray Tuesday morning. I had just come off a 13-hour shift, one of those nights in the ICU where life and death seemed to hang in the air with every alarm, every desperate family member pacing the halls. By the time I dragged myself home, I felt hollow. All I wanted was silence and the comfort of knowing I could shut the world out. But instead, I walked into a house full of noise. My father watching the news at top volume, my mother chatting with a neighbor she had invited in without telling me, and the smell of food I hadn't asked for filling the kitchen. It was as though the house itself no longer belonged to me. I carried my bag upstairs, shut the door, and sat on the floor with my head in my hands. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind. If I didn't fight back now, I might never get my life back. The first thing I did was call Claire, my old friend from nursing school who had gone on to law school. She specialized in property law, and though I felt a pit in my stomach at the thought of dragging my parents into legal territory, I needed to know the truth. I explained everything in a low, steady voice, trying not to let it crack with emotion: the uninvited move-in, the lock change attempt, the way they had taken over my home. When I finished, there was silence on the line before she spoke. "Emily, I need you to hear me. Legally, this is your house. You are the sole owner. They have no lease, no legal rights to live there unless you allow it. If you want them gone, you can ask them to leave right now." Her words should have felt empowering, but instead they terrified me. The thought of standing up to my parents, of potentially evicting them, made my chest tighten. "What if they refuse?" I asked. Then you'd have to go through formal eviction proceedings, she admitted. It's messy, especially because they're family. But you have every right to protect your home. Start documenting everything: dates, incidents, witnesses. Protect yourself. When I hung up, my hands were trembling. I wanted to feel relief, but instead I felt the weight of what this could mean. I wasn't just fighting for peace anymore. I was preparing for war. That night, I booked an emergency appointment with my therapist, Dr. Simmons. I'd been seeing her off and on for years to cope with the stress of nursing, but this was different. I poured everything out: the favoritism, the money they had given Ryan, the way they treated me like a child in my own house. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she leaned forward. Emily, what you're describing is a textbook case of parentification and role entrenchment. You were cast as the responsible one, the one who didn't need help, while Ryan was the one who always required rescuing. Your parents have spent years reinforcing that pattern. Now, they're expecting you to take care of them, because in their minds, that's who you are. Her words cut through me. But I'm not their caretaker, I protested. I'm their daughter. Exactly, she said. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing the difference. They confused your independence with obligation. And now, you have to decide whether you're willing to break that cycle. I left her office with a strange mix of dread and clarity. Breaking the cycle meant standing firm, even when guilt tried to drown me. It meant risking their anger, their disappointment, maybe even losing them entirely. But the alternative was worse: losing myself. Still, I knew I couldn't face this battle alone. I reached out to my cousin Julia, the one person in my extended family who had always been blunt and honest. I invited her over for coffee, and, as we sat at my kitchen table, I unloaded everything. She listened, her brow furrowing deeper with every detail. Emily, she said finally, that's not the story the family's been told. Your mom told Aunt Kathy that you invited them to live here because you were lonely in this big house. And she said they only gave Ryan a small loan for his apartment deposit. Everyone thinks they're helping you, not the other way around. The room seemed to spin. My parents hadn't just invaded my home, they had rewritten the narrative to make me look like the needy one, the one begging for their company. I felt sick. So everyone thinks I asked for this? Julia nodded. That's why no one's questioned it. Honestly, I think some people even see you as lucky, like you're getting their support, not giving it. Anger burned in my chest. Not only had they taken over my space, but they had twisted the truth so that I couldn't even count on my family for understanding. For once in my life, I didn't just feel taken for granted. I felt betrayed on a level that cut to the bone. That night, I took the first steps toward reclaiming control. While my parents were out visiting friends, I installed security cameras at the front and back doors. I changed the Wi-Fi password. I walked through each room of the house, photographing my belongings, documenting serial numbers, making an inventory of everything I owned. It felt paranoid, maybe even cruel, but Claire's voice echoed in my head. Protect yourself. And as I moved through my house, snapping photos of furniture and electronics, I realized I was also reclaiming something else: the will to fight back. For too long, I had swallowed my feelings, convinced myself that keeping the peace was worth sacrificing my comfort. But the truth was clear now. Peace built on silence wasn't peace at all. When I finally sat down at my desk, I opened a blank document and began typing. With Claire's guidance, I drafted a formal written notice to my parents. It was firm but not cruel, outlining a 30-day timeline for them to move out. I included information on senior apartments nearby, and even offered to cover their first 3 months of rent. I wanted them gone, but I wasn't abandoning them. I was simply drawing a line in the sand. As I stared at the words on the screen, my heart pounded. I knew this would spark a storm. They would cry, they would rage, they would guilt-trip me with stories of sacrifices they had made. But this wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future, my future, and whether I was willing to keep living under their control or finally take it back. Folding the printed notice into an envelope, I felt the shift inside me. The guilt was still there, but beneath it was something stronger, something I hadn't felt in weeks: resolve. I didn't know exactly how the confrontation would unfold, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The battle for my home, my freedom, and my identity was about to begin. The morning of the showdown, I woke up before dawn, my chest tight with dread. The house was silent, but my thoughts were deafening. For weeks, my home had been filled with voices that weren't mine, routines that weren't mine, rules I hadn't agreed to. Today, I had to reclaim it, or lose myself for good. I brewed coffee, hands trembling as I went over the notes I had prepared with Claire and the advice I had written down from Dr. Simmons. Calm, steady, factual. No yelling, no guilt. Boundaries, not battles. But as the clock ticked closer to noon, my resolve felt like it was built on sand. At 11:30 sharp, Diane arrived. She was a professional mediator, someone Claire had recommended. Tall, composed, with a calm authority about her, she immediately rearranged the living room. "Chairs in a circle," she explained. "No hierarchy, everyone sits as equals." Watching her move my furniture with quiet precision steadied me somehow. It was the first time in weeks that someone had taken charge of my house with my permission. My parents came through the door first. My mother's face tightened the moment she saw Diane, as though I had committed an unforgivable sin by inviting an outsider into family business. My father asked bluntly, "Who's this?" "This is Diane," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "She's here to help us have a conversation." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "You needed a stranger for this?" "I needed someone neutral," I answered. My heart pounded, but I didn't look away. Ryan strolled in 10 minutes late, as usual, wearing another designer shirt and carrying himself like he was walking into a cocktail party, not an intervention. He dropped into his chair with a smirk. "This should be fun," he muttered. Diane opened the session with clear ground rules: no interruptions, no personal attacks. Each person would have a chance to speak. She gestured to me. "Emily, since you asked for this meeting, I'd like you to begin." I took a breath that felt like it might split my chest. "6 weeks ago, you moved into my home without asking," I began, my voice shaking at first, then gaining strength. "Since then, you've rearranged my rooms, hosted guests without my permission, invaded my private spaces, and even attempted to change my locks. I feel disrespected. I feel like a guest in my own house. And I can't live this way anymore." My mother immediately tried to interrupt, tears welling in her eyes. But Diane held up a hand. "You'll have your turn," I continued. "I know you sold the house. I know you gave Ryan nearly all the money. That was your decision, but the consequences of it have landed on me. I was never asked if I wanted to take care of you. Never asked if I was willing to have my home turned into a boarding house. I love you, but I need boundaries. And the boundary is this: you cannot live here anymore. I've given you 30 days to find a place. I've even offered to pay for the first 3 months of rent. But I need my home back." Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then my father leaned forward, his face flushed. "After everything we did for you? We raised you for 18 years, put food on the table, paid for your clothes, your braces, and this is how you repay us? Kicking us out like we're strangers?" "I didn't ask to be born," I said quietly, but firmly. "You chose to be parents. I'm choosing to protect myself." My mother's tears spilled over. "We thought you'd want us here. Families live together, Emily. That's what people do. You've always been so difficult, so independent. Why can't you just let us help you by being here?" "Help me?" My voice cracked, anger bubbling to the surface. "You gave away your retirement to Ryan and expected me to carry the weight of your choices. That's not help. That's abandonment dressed up as obligation." All eyes turned to Ryan then, who shifted uncomfortably but still tried to play it cool. "Look, I didn't ask them to give me the money," he said, shrugging. "No," I shot back, "but you took it. You accepted it knowing they'd have nothing left, knowing they'd end up here, and you don't seem to care that they've upended my life while you play house in the seaport." For the first time, his smirk faltered. He looked down, fiddling with his watch, as if the weight of my words had finally pierced through his armor. Diane stepped in then, her voice calm but firm. It sounds like the real issue here is communication, or the lack of it. Robert, Linda, what was your plan when you sold the house? My parents exchanged a glance, one of those silent exchanges they'd perfected over years of partnership. Finally, my dad spoke. We thought we'd stay here, permanently. The air left my lungs. Even though I had suspected, hearing it confirmed felt like a knife. You plan to live with me forever? Without even asking? You've got all this space, Mom said, gesturing vaguely. And you're so busy at work. We thought you'd appreciate having us here, looking after things. Looking after things. That was the phrase that broke me. My house wasn't things. My life wasn't things. And they hadn't been looking after me, they had been dismantling everything I had built. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice steady now. This house is mine. I worked for it, I earned it, and I will not give it up. You have 30 days. That's final. The room erupted. My mother sobbed harder. My father accused me of being ungrateful. Ryan muttered something about me being heartless. But through it all, Diane kept control, reminding them of the ground rules, redirecting when voices rose too high. Eventually, the chaos settled into reluctant silence. It was Ryan, surprisingly, who broke it. He cleared his throat, looking less certain than I'd ever seen him. Maybe I can help cover some of their rent. $1,000 a month, just to get them started, since they did help me out. His voice trailed off, but it was the first time he had admitted responsibility. It wasn't a full solution, but it was something. A crack in his armor, a sign that maybe even if just for a moment he realized the damage he had been part of. By the end of the session, we had an agreement on paper. My parents would move out within 30 days. Ryan would contribute financially. I would help with moving expenses. It was fragile, tenuous, but it was a plan. As they left, my mother avoided my eyes, my father muttered under his breath, and Ryan lingered awkwardly before walking out. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't peace, it was the calm before the storm. Because agreements on paper don't erase years of patterns, and 30 days can feel like an eternity when you're living under the same roof with people who believe they own you. And as the days ticked by, I learned just how hard my parents would fight to hold on to what was never theirs to begin with. When the moving truck finally pulled away, taking the last of my parents' boxes with it, I stood on the porch of my house and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for weeks. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was restorative. For the first time since they had appeared uninvited at my doorstep, the house was mine again. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, even the light switches, as though reclaiming them one by one. The recliner was gone. The kitchen cabinets were mine to reorganize. My office was once again a place for focus instead of intrusion. It felt like coming home after being away for far too long, even though I had never technically left. But peace wasn't just about the absence of their presence. It was about what I had learned in the process. I realized that boundaries aren't cruel, and saying no to family doesn't mean you love them any less. It means you love yourself enough not to let someone else dismantle your life, even if those people share your blood. For years, I had carried the invisible weight of being the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who could always handle more. That role had become a cage. This ordeal forced me to break it open. The guilt lingered at first, my mother's tears, my father's accusations, Ryan's resentment. But as time passed, I saw that I had done what was necessary not only for myself, but also for them. By forcing them to stand on their own, I gave them back the responsibility that should never have been mine to carry. And as difficult as it was, I began to understand something powerful. Love without respect corrodes, but love with boundaries can heal. A year later, the relationships are not perfect, but they are clearer. My parents are settled in a modest apartment. My dad has even found part-time work he enjoys, and my mom has made friends in her community. Ryan still struggles, but he contributes to their support, and for once, he has to face the consequences of his own choices. And me? I come home after my long shifts at the hospital, close my door, and know that my peace is intact. My house feels like my sanctuary again, and more importantly, I feel like I've reclaimed myself. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. You are allowed to protect your space. You are allowed to say no, even to family. Boundaries don't mean rejection, they mean preservation. Because you can't pour from an empty cup, and you can't love fully if you're being consumed. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to set a boundary with family, even when it felt impossible? How did it change you?